Hello and welcome to another Midweek Wardies Waffle Extra. This one though isn't midweek because it's a Monday, but it's from the NFU Conference last week where I'm putting up a lot of the presentations that were recorded, and there's some really useful snippets in all of these, except this one. There was 3 people talking and I missed this first one. I didn't get to record that. I thought I had, but I hadn't done, and that was Sarah Bradbury, who is Chief Exec of the industry of the grocery distributors. Anyway, the first one you're going to be seeing is Professor Susan Jebb, and she's chair of the Food Standards Agency, looking at food safety. Lots of really interesting points in her talk. Second one we're looking at is Kate Nichols, and she's chief exec of the UK Hospitality. So that again is some really useful points in there. And then all 3 of them come back on stage to answer questions. And we're looking at the safety of food. We're looking at supermarkets, how they buy the food, which is really interesting, and the buying policy of them. Food labelling, another one that comes up. That's a huge passion of mine, that there's a lot of things wrong with food labelling, and really all things food. Anyway, let's crack on. Here you are with this one, and we'll see you at the end.
She's been chair of the Food Standards Agency since 2021, which is the government non-ministerial department. The FSA's fundamental mission is food you can trust. Susan.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you very much for inviting me to today's session. So at the Food Standards Agency, as you heard, our mission is food you can trust, and what we mean by that is food that is safe and food that is what it says it is. Now, since Brexit, the FSA has taken on a really big, new, expanded role. We've essentially become the guarantor of British food to the world. So our presence, particularly in relation to products of animal origin, reassures other countries that British food is safe. That role is an incredibly essential service for farmers. So a strong FSA means that we can continue to facilitate our export trade. So I'd argue that any plan for the future needs to be one that upholds consumer confidence in food at home and builds trust in our food abroad. And that needs a trusted regulator. That said, I do recognise that first and foremost, keeping food safe is the responsibility of farmers and of food businesses. And I'm keen that as a regulator, we remember that most of our job is about supporting you and other food businesses to do the right thing. And of course, taking enforcement action when that doesn't happen. We have a responsibility to do that efficiently and effectively. And the FSA board is absolutely committed to making reforms in the way we work so that we can actually be a better regulator. For example, one of the things we're currently doing is trialling enterprise-level regulation of the big supermarkets. I think there's a very strong argument that these hugely powerful national businesses should be regulated at a national level, not by individual local authorities. To do that fully, we'll need legislation in the next Parliament, but we're trying to put in place the building blocks of that improved system. We heard this morning from Minette and from the Prime Minister of the importance of food standards. When I became chair of the FSA, we introduced an annual report to Parliament on food standards. And I'm pleased to say that despite all of the challenges of the last few years, the sort of 3 C's, COVID, climate change and conflict, food standards do appear to be holding up well. That's not good luck, it's not chance, it's down to really hard work by everybody involved in the food system. But our report on food standards has also highlighted some really critical risks in the system, notably the shortage of trained staff, especially public health vets and environmental health officers. And I'm really pleased that following our report, the EFRA Select Committee have decided to announce an inquiry into the veterinary workforce. Now, the FSA was set up not just to protect food standards, but also to uphold the consumer interest in food. And so we have a regular survey where we ask consumers about their concerns. It's kind of really encouraging that food safety doesn't come up. People trust that their food is safe. But interestingly, they trust imported food much less than domestically produced food. People trust British farmers, And that's a real opportunity for you to differentiate your products. And we really welcome the government's plans to consult on improved labelling. We've also heard many times that in Britain we produce food to some of the highest environmental and welfare standards in the world. And at FSA we're very keen to see much more consistency in the way that information is communicated to consumers so that they can make an informed choice. I'm delighted the FSA is involved in a project called the Food Data Transparency Partnership, working with DEFRA and with DHSC. And this will really try to give industry an opportunity to demonstrate its environmental credentials in a consistent way. That said, the challenge of working towards high food standards is that the top concern of consumers remains price. And that worry isn't confined just to the poorest households. In our survey, 9 out of 10 people said that cost of food was their main concern. That's really tricky for farmers because it means the supply chain is going to continue to put pressure on you to reduce costs at a time when we know that many farmers are already struggling to make a profit. I think that we, as the FSA, need to work with you to help consumers get the best value from the food that they buy. That means helping them to recognise the quality of the food that they're purchasing as an investment in their own health and indeed the health of the planet too. Finally, I just want to make a brief mention of ultra-processed food. In our consumer tracker, this has absolutely shot up the agenda of consumer concerns in the last year. 3/4 of people said they were concerned, second only to worries about price. Now, while that's a challenge for much of the food industry, it's a real opportunity for farmers to speak out about the benefits of the minimally processed food that you produce. There's lots we don't understand about ultra-processed food. It might just be it's a new catchphrase for foods high in fat, sugar and salt, or it may be it's a marker of an industrialised food system, or it might be about specific additives, which is part of the responsibility of the FSA. But whatever the mechanism, it's an opportunity for you as farmers to wave a flag for the intrinsic value of the core foods when they leave the farm gate. So finally, this conference is about a plan for the future. Just as Sarah said, I think that this is something where none of us can do it alone. We absolutely have to work together. And the good news is that everybody I speak to, whether it's farmers or manufacturers, retailers or government, everybody wants food that's safe and food that's sustainable for their own health and for the planet. We agree on the goal. The challenge is just how are we going to get there? We're going to have to work together. As we've heard a lot, we need to work to make the most of our domestic production, but also recognise that we're part of a global food system and seize all of the opportunities that offers for exports. As a regulator, I think we've got a crucially important role to play, upholding and celebrating our high British food standards. And I'm absolutely delighted to be here with you today to be able to have this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan. And now I'd like to introduce Kate Nichols, OBE. Kate has been CEO of UK Hospitality since its inception in 2018, having previously worked as the CEO and Strategic Affairs Director of the Association of Licensed Multiple Retailers. We've worked with Kate on some of the issues facing us around labour over the past years, and that's a common challenge that we're still looking for solutions to. But Kate, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tom, and I'm really pleased to be able to join you here today. As Tom said, we have worked really closely together as the NFU and UK Hospitality. It seems really fitting that I'm at the end of the panel because I'm at the opposite end of the food supply chain, but it's a really important chain, and what we've done working with Terry and his team and Minette over the past few years, going through the COVID crisis, the Brexit discussions and all of those challenges, is to make sure that we have a really unified voice across the whole of the food supply chain to talk about the most important issues. It really is vital that we have that strong representation going into government and to the opposition to make sure that they understand how uniquely linked all of the farm to fork supply chain is, and that that's not just a trite phrase, it means something in practice. And actually, if you look at hospitality, your end consumers, the people who do help to feed the nation, there is quite a symbiotic relationship between hospitality and the farming community and the farming sector as a whole. We are a large industry, a large sector. We're made up of many thousands of small and medium-sized businesses. And that means that we have similar component parts to the farming community and the different ways in which we operate. We are challenged by feeding different parts of the day and different people at different times, but we also have the same innate pressures that are coming through businesses that are perhaps different to the other parts of the supply chain. So when I speak to many of my hospitality businesses, and I know speaking to many others, we have the same issues to do with the cost inputs that are going into the business, the rising prices that we're seeing of our raw ingredients, but most particularly energy and wages, those two big areas of our cost base that have increased exponentially. Those are not quite the same pressures that you see going into the retail and food manufacturing sides of the food supply chain, and therefore that element of commonality of approach, commonality of concern and challenge means that we need to work very collaboratively together to get the right solutions and to get the outcomes that we want. And there's a shared objective too in making sure that we can offer UK consumers good quality, nutritious, high-value food, and that they understand the value of the food that they are buying and consuming when they are consuming out of home, and that there is a craft and an input of costs that goes to make that delivered. In people, it generates £140 billion of revenue. That means as a sector we're bigger than aerospace, automotive and pharmaceuticals put together. And in the associated supply chain directly into hospitality, a further 1.5 million people work in that sector. So a very large part of the economy. We are the fourth largest industrial sector, third largest employer and second largest services export in the form of tourism and hospitality businesses. So foreign visitors spend more eating and drinking out in UK hospitality businesses than all of our food and drink manufacturing exports put together. But crucially, we are also a vital shop window for the manufactured food, for the production that comes through, and for good quality British ingredients. And we know that there is a value that comes alongside that when we survey our customers and we ask them about what they are looking for from the food that they eat and purchase through us. We know that they recognise the value, as the others have said, of British produced food, of that farm to forks journey. It may sometimes be tinged with a little bit of nostalgia and a little bit of fairy tale, but there is a real value that goes alongside it, and we do need to work collaboratively together to make sure we can tell that story better in the out-of-home market. So some recent research we did with the Welsh Government and partners in the Welsh supply chain found that 8 out of 10 customers went up higher if they were foreign visitors, but 8 out of 10 looked for Welsh produce when they were going out to eat and drink in Wales. 79% of them said that they would be seeing that as synonymous with artisan production, a rural way of life, maintaining that culture, the rural culture, the farming culture, and the tourism culture, and crucially 59% of them said that they would be prepared to pay more for that kind of produce. So that gives a sort of case study of ways in which we want to work much more closely to make sure that we can communicate that going forward. And then finally, we share the aspiration and really welcome the acknowledgement today that we need an annual food security report and to look at the food supply chain as a whole. We are intimately linked. If parts of hospitality are hit or parts of the hospitality supply chain are hit, then you see knock-on effects up the supply chain. Equally, if farmers are making decisions about the produce that they are planting, that they are growing, that they are producing, and the way in which they're supplying it. Again, we have challenges in being able to meet that demand, which is undoubtedly out there. And our aspiration is to continue providing great quality, nutritious, well-valued British food to 20 million customers a week, and 20 million more in the public sector who we feed on a weekly basis too. So together, I think we have a shared aspiration of feeding the nation, feeding it well, and making sure that we can provide a strong and robust and resilient future for the businesses in the food supply chain from farm to fork. Thank you. Everything, and making sure that we have good quality imports that meet our standards or are better than them, do not undercut them. that's the way forward. But we push British first. We do as much as we can in those key commodities. So all of the coffee you buy is British milk. And you know, British chicken, British beef in lots of our venues. We just need to be making sure that we've got those robust supply chains across the board, and then we are working with the NFU on local practical solutions to be able to unlock that local supply chain rather than relying upon national.
Another key ally here in the core standards request, which is a critical ask as we move into the election. Sarah, you talked about price still being the dominant factor when people are making shopping decisions. I mean, how do we overcome that? We want to tell the story of sustainability. We want a greener future for everybody, but we also need to be profitable. And I guess the biggest challenge is how do we square that circle? Because at the moment, the consumer doesn't seem willing to pay for those higher standards of production.
Thank you. So, look, price is a massive problem, and as we know, all the input costs that we've just been talking about coming in has increased prices, but it's also increased problems for consumers. So we know cost of living and how people are eating in this country is a problem and has become more of a problem. I think the important thing is when we think about how we celebrate British, so when we think about food and the whole supply chain, actually how do we increase that attractiveness? If I think of how popular British food was and how through the pandemic, actually we've really got to try and capture that and bring that back, because actually the food industry as a whole doesn't have the reputation that it had through the pandemic. And so how do we think about a whole education and really talking about British food in a different way, educating people in a different way, and energising around the food industry in itself.
Thank you. Susan, I'm going to move on to a slightly different topic for you. You talked about ultra-processed foods, and I think that's a real buzzword at the moment, and if anybody's listened or read...
The challenge we have is we're a £130 million regulator with an industry worth, you know, £130 billion. And so the funding that we have just about enables us to sort of maintain the standards and make sure they're not being eroded. But if we want to go further, if we want to know more about the standards of food that's coming into the country, about their production standards for animal welfare, that's going to require a whole new set of work and effort, which at the minute we're not resourced to do. So if we think that's important, then we're going to have to invest in order to get that information. As it is, we're really limited to taking action as quickly as we can when incidents occur in order to protect the country. And so, you know, things like the new import controls coming in on food from the EU, incredibly important. And actually, I'm delighted they seem to have started and being implemented pretty well. Obviously, the fiscal checks coming in April. And that will give us an additional line of defence, but also, crucially, through the paperwork that goes with it, it will give us information and intelligence about where incidents are occurring, and that should allow us to be much more responsive in the future.
Sarah Bell, could you just come to the microphone just to expand on this? You've got a question around this area.
I have long held concerns over the permeability of the UK border, and make no apology for asking the question again of Susan Jupp that I asked 2 years ago. Is the border architecture, structure and funding in the UK suitable for a post-Brexit Britain? With 57 tonnes of illegal meat seized at Dover since September 2022, and the border control point being moved 22 miles inland, it appears to bring an unacceptable level of risk. Does the FSA and UK Border Force have the resources to ensure UK food and agriculture is not exposed to the loss of income and consumer confidence which a preventable disease or food safety crisis would bring? Trust arrives on foot and leaves on horseback, and farmers cannot be the only vanguard of food safety.
Just to expand on that a little bit further, I mean, there was obviously the import checks are now 22 miles inland. And one of the advantages of having the import checks at the border is the deterrent to those illegal imports. But we've now removed that deterrent because vehicles can turn left or right rather than going 22 miles inland.
Okay, so firstly, the FSA has been incredibly clear that we need import controls to be brought in, and we called that out in our last 2 annual reports. So that's the first thing. I'm totally with you. It's a really important part of our protection. The second thing is that we, until this year, we have not had controls on food coming from the EU. So the fact that we have now is a step forward. So we're moving in the right direction. That's a good thing, and the physical checks will come in April. The third issue is that we need to remember the difference between legal and illegal imports. So where you have bad actors in the system, we can put any number of border checks in, and actually they will still seek to undermine them. So what the border control points are supposed to be doing is actually monitoring legal imports of food. And so the question of where they're cited is a matter for DEFRA and for government. It's not one for the FSA. As you know, with Dover, there was a choice of two places. Both of them were outside the port. So lorries would have to go, whether they go to Bastion or to Sevington, have to leave the port. Now, you can decide whether it's a greater risk if they go 5 miles or 20 miles, but they are not being assessed within the port. If you've got a legal, responsible business who is required to present itself for inspection, they are required to do that. And if they don't do that, the port health authorities can take action and take that food off the market. So there is no incentive for legal, responsible businesses not to present themselves for the checks. The question that wherever the port is, the question then is, what do we do about illegal imports? And that is a whole other business. As you know, the Food Standards Agency have the National Food Crime Unit. We work closely with the port health authorities. We have done, what are they called? When you swoop in and do some checks, and have found quite large quantities of meat being brought in illegally. It's a real concern, and we absolutely need to ensure we have the resources at the border to deal with that, and that we also have, the intelligence to allow us to make these checks. It's a bit like when we're coming in through airports. You cannot check everybody all of the time. This has got to be intelligence-led, and we need to invest in things like the Food Crime Unit to help us know how best to stop these illegal imports. But I think it's incredibly important that we keep the legal system in our minds, hold that separately from how we deal with illegal trade. In terms of resources, as an issue, I'm absolutely sure that every port health authority and every local authority wishes it had more resources. We in the FSA need to do everything we can to help them use the resources they have got most effectively, and that's about data and intelligence with consumers. And one of the challenges is that responsibilities for what goes on the label are fragmented right across multiple different parts of government. I really welcome the labelling consultation that's coming up, but if I'm honest, I think what we need is a much broader look at labelling. What's on the label? What do consumers really need to know? Is it best presented? What has to absolutely physically be on the packet? What could we actually better do in other ways, whether that's QR codes or shelf edges or however? So I think that it's always tempting. Somehow we jump at labelling. Or if we just label it, that will be fine. But there is a real danger that things which consumers really, really, really need to know, things like allergens, for example, are getting obscured and squeezed out by a plethora of other information. So I think it probably is time for us to take a step back, ask what we need to know. What do consumers need? What do they want? And we need to separate that from the data that we might want in the food system. Because there's a great argument for collecting some of the work, some of the data that FDTP is trying to do. But we don't need to necessarily communicate all of that to consumers. Some of that is just helpful either in a business-to-business or business-to-government relationship. So I think we shouldn't just jump to labelling as being the answer. Because in fact, much of it, if we're thinking about nutrition labelling or potentially eco-labelling, does not change consumer behaviour as much as we like to imagine it will. It's much better at changing business behaviour, where businesses strive to get the best nutritional label or the best eco score or whatever else. So I think we need a much more a thoughtful approach to labelling rather than just thinking about little elements here and there and just sticking it on the label.
I think it's also really important for DEFRA to consider what their role is in enabling the delivery of this big because I think, as I've already said, we've got farmers right the way across the country that are going to be have to provide this information. And I think there really is a policy role here as well to enable the transition.
So that's it for tonight. Tomorrow night is the last talk from the NFU conference, where we had the three political parties come to talk to us about their manifesto and where they see farming going if they were to win the general election. So we had Mark Spencer representing the Conservatives, we had Daniel Zeitner representing Labour, and we had Tim Farron representing the Lib Dems. Three really very different talks, but some really fascinating presentations and some facts and figures. So that's tomorrow night. So thanks for watching. We'll see you then.